All right, let's go over it again. Hey folks, this is not super recent news at the time that I'm talking about it, but when I first read it, I didn't think that I would have enough thoughts to make a video out of it. I thought maybe I'd make a short at most, but the thing is, while we are going to be covering ground that I have covered repeatedly, ultimately there is some nuances to this that were not applicable other times I've talked about this that I feel are worth addressing, because I feel like if I don't, then the kind of people who, well, not people who disagree with me in bad faith, because they'll just twist anything I say, but people who disagree with me and try and be in a more good faith mode, or at least question some of the things that I say, are probably going to bring up some of the ways in which this is different than other times. So I just kind of want to get ahead of that. So, if you didn't know, The Last of Us Season 3 is in the process of filming. Now, this is going to cover the back half of The Last of Us Part 2 video game. A quick reminder from my own relationship to The Last of Us. I played a little bit of the first game. I stopped playing because that was one of the games where I realized, oh, my motion sickness really has gotten so bad that I can't really be playing stuff like this anymore. It was like right at the start of it getting really bad, and it's only gotten worse since then. And I never played the second one, partially for the motion sickness thing, but also partially, honestly, looking into it and reading about it and all that. I was like, I'm not sure I want to play that. It was like too tonally miserable. I'm not into that degree of just misery. I'm just not. That having been said, I watched the first season, really, really liked it. It was phenomenal. Watched the second season, didn't love it. It's not that I think that it like completely fell apart, but I pretty much spotted immediately like, oh, here's all the reasons I wouldn't have liked the game either. And I kind of already made the decision that I'm not going to watch the third season, just because I'm at a point where I think it's in my own best interest to not engage with something that I'm pretty positive I'm going to dislike if it's going to ask that much of my time. Like, I'm more willing to engage with a movie I think might be bad than I am an entire season of television. And I don't think I'm unreasonable for feeling that way. So I had no intention of watching this second half. But a character that is going to appear and originates from the game is the character of Lev. And some behind the scenes shots have shown us the performer who's going to be playing the part. And we now know more about the casting. And it dredges up an old problem. That being, Lev is a trans man character. And the actress, Kiriana Crater, is, to the best of our knowledge, cisgender. Now, I use the phrase to the best of our knowledge for a reason. That's one of the things I'm going to be touching on. I will address it. But let's remind ourselves here that this is not my first rodeo, addressing the idea of why it is a problem for cisgender actors to play transgender characters. I have talked about this a lot most recently in regards to the second and third season of Squid Game. So I don't want to dive too deep into stuff I've already covered, but to reiterate, there is an inherent problem with casting a cisgender actor to play a transgender character for a number of reasons. There is the basic issue that there are not very many trans characters who are written into shows and movies. There are not very many opportunities for trans actors, and it is, at best, infuriating that the few trans parts that are created can oftentimes be given to cisgender people to play. And just to be clear, if you're thinking, well, trans people should just try and go and get cast as cisgender characters, then that's not really how it works. The notion of open casting, truly open casting, where you just say, hey, everybody come in, read for the part, we'll pick who's best, happens incredibly rarely. True open casting, like you probably imagine, actually almost never happens. It is simply put far more efficient to narrow down your audition pool by saying we are looking for somebody in this age range, of this gender, of about this height, this build, who is fluent in this language and is this approximate skin tone. Narrowing it down makes your job far, far easier. So trans people don't really get cast in roles that are truly open to anybody because very few roles are truly open to anybody. Because if you ever thought it was a case of like, oh, this part could easily be played by a man or a woman, I bet they'd let anybody audition for it. No, they definitely didn't. So trans and non-binary people, I say trans and non-binary as if they're different things. They're not. Non-binary is a form of trans because if you identify as anything other than the gender you were assigned at birth, you are trans, just by definition. But they are kind of separate conversations in terms of what people, audiences, executives, etc., tend to think of when they think of them. So I will still use the phrase trans and non-binary. But the point is, trans and non-binary actors are very rarely considered, much less cast, in roles that are not explicitly written as trans and non-binary characters. So when those few parts written theoretically for them get taken by cisgender actors, that is innately infuriating, if not massively demoralizing, for any trans or non-binary performers trying to get anywhere in this damned industry. Philosophically, even if that wasn't a problem, there is still a problem, which is that when you cast a cisgender person to play a transgender part, it reinforces a lot of negative ideas and inaccurate ideas about trans people, especially if you cast somebody who is the gender that the trans character transitioned out of instead of the one they transitioned into. In other words, and I'll explain why this is the case in a minute, but in other words, if you are going to cast a cisgender person playing a trans character, which you should not be doing, but if you do, it is better to cast a cis woman to play a trans woman or a cis man to play a trans man than it is for a cis man to play a trans woman or a cis woman to play a trans man. Ultimately, despite any other badly aged issues with it, it is better to have a situation like Chandler's dad in Friends, where the character was played by Kathleen Turner, a cisgender actress, than it is for something like Dallas Buyers Club, where a trans woman was played by Jared Leto. I mean, Jared Leto shouldn't be playing anything, but that's besides the point. The reason why it is far worse doing it this way is when you cast an actor who is the gender that the character transitioned out of, then you reinforce, even if the narrative does not say this, just by the virtue of that casting, you reinforce the entire concept that trans people are actually the thing that they were assigned at birth and are just pretending, because that's what the actor is doing. When you cast a cisgender man to play a trans woman, what you have put up on the screen is a man playing pretend in makeup who ultimately is still a man. And when that's how you represent trans people, that notion gets reinforced, and that notion is used to actively oppress trans people. The idea that we are not what we claim to be. The idea that trans men are just confused women who need to have the idea of femininity be bolstered to them and reinforced, and they should be having babies. And trans women are confused, effeminate men who should, I don't know, go be drafted in the military and have that nonsense just run right out of you. Maybe even if you don't think those far extremes as the solutions, the idea that it is presented as, well, this is really just a man playing dress up, or this is really just a woman who's, kind of just says that she's a man. That's what you're presenting when you cast this way. And that is what they have done with this casting. Now, I want to emphasize right now, I do not in any way blame Kiriana Crater. She is 15. I don't expect her to have the deepest knowledge of this stuff. I do expect far better of the people running the show, casting it, directing it, producing it. Them I have expectations of. It's not her fault. Leave her alone. Don't harass her. I would hold an adult, established actor with a lengthy career responsible for a choice like this. Her, not so much. So I kind of want to remove her as a person from this conversation. So when I talk about the casting, why it's a problem, the people who I'm upset at are not her. Now, to get into the character of Lev, who again, I admit I only know what I've read about because I have not played the game, but based off the behind the scenes images that showed up on Twitter, this does appear to be an accurate recreation, at least visually, of the character, which removes really any likelihood that the character was being rewritten to no longer be a trans man. I mean, the reason Lev has a shaved head is because that is how the men in the cult that he was pulled into are intended to look and behave. That's why he shaved his head. So if this was a case of the character showed up with long hair or even like short but still, not a shaved head, then it would have been an open question, is this even still a trans character anymore? Which would have been its own issue, that you were taking one of the few instances of trans representation in a mainstream successful thing and removing it when transferring it to a different medium. That would have been still a problem, but a different conversation. That does not appear to be what we are dealing with. Now, something I noted the last time I talked about this actually does not happen nearly as much as it used to. One of the things that I was kind of pleasantly surprised to find out when I did a little bit of digging before I made the video on the Squid Game casting was that this is happening way, way, way less often in Hollywood, which is good. It also, unfortunately, seems to have lined up with an overall downturn of trans lead characters in major motion pictures at all. There are just fewer of them. But if they're going to exist, they should not be cast as cisgender people. So, we can't have everything. Or indeed, sometimes it feels like we can't have anything, but moving on. I said that there were some aspects of this that are issues that I have not had to address within this sort of situation before. And I do think that they are worth bringing up to give the full picture and the full nuance and explain why, while I have my same overall conclusion, you should not have cast like this, there are still some things that are a bit different here. Now, according to an article in Deadline, Lev was cast through quote-unquote inclusive casting. That is not a term really defined. It's obviously intended to imply that trans actors would have been considered for the part, but were beaten out by the actor ultimately chosen. I would still say that if you're casting a trans part, you shouldn't be considering cisgender people anyways. And then that on top of the fact that we don't really know what inclusive casting in this case means. Maybe they were actually just far more inclusive about the potential race of the character, but we don't know. Inclusive casting is vague, and if you don't define exactly what you mean by that, it's also kind of useless and unhelpful. But that is the claim. Now, the main thing that makes this a little bit more different than previous times is that this is actually a case where we are talking about a character who is a minor. Lev as a character is 13. Now, Crater, the actress playing Lev, is 15, but 15 can pass for 13 pretty decently. So that I don't expect as much of an issue. But we are dealing with both a character and an actor who are both minors under the age of 18. And especially in our current political environment, it would be dishonest of me to not say that that probably brought different concerns to the mix. Because while trans youth absolutely exist, they are the biggest target right now of the right. I know that the right will claim that they are in fact trying to protect youth that has been brainwashed into believing themselves to be trans. That's not what they're doing. They know that the suicidality of trans-identifying teens goes up drastically when they do not have access to trans-affirming and gender-affirming medical care. They are fully aware. They don't care. They would rather teens be dead than trans. But anyways, that is the environment that this is currently happening in. So this whole thing can get caught up in the weeds of the question that is generally a question asked by cis people. It is usually not as much of a concern to the trans community. There are some who get hung up on this. I don't. But the question is, well, how do we know that they're trans? Now, when you are talking about trans adults, there is usually very clearly either the currently taking, has previously taken, or is actively trying to take trans-affirming medical care, be it hormone replacement therapy, be it surgeries, be it whatever else. They may or may not have access to that. They may or may not have the means to acquire that, or whatever else. But that is annoyingly often used as a metric by cis people as to whether or not someone is, quote unquote, really trans. When you're talking about minors, that gets complicated because even though I think that's kind of a BS metric, no, not kind of, it is a BS metric. There are trans people who either can't access any of that stuff or honestly don't want it. That doesn't invalidate their identity. But anyways, whole other conversation. When it comes to minors, it is more complicated because if you are calculating that and that's part of your metric for who does or doesn't count as trans, well, trans youth don't have access to most trans-affirming medical care that would actually result in things like facial hair growth, deepening of the voice, etc. They are barred from that until they are 18. That's assuming that they are not barred to it even after that because, yeah, they're trying to take away adults' trans medical care and have been for a little while. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I have talked about this repeatedly. But anyways, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to get down additional rabbit holes, but all this stuff is interconnected. My point being, it is incredibly unlikely that if they cast age accurate, that they were going to be able to cast somebody who was actually on any kind of hormone regimen or would more cleanly clock to a cisgender understanding as a real trans person. So the whole thing gets a little muddier right off the bat. Now, are there people that age 13 to 15 who do identify as trans men at that age? Yeah, absolutely. Were they actively looking for that? How inclusive was this inclusive casting? We don't know. But from a practical standpoint, given that pretty much nobody at the age of the character or the actor they ultimately cast is going to be on hormones, from a purely physical presentation standpoint, it doesn't make a difference. It becomes a wash. I think there's also a potential argument to be made that if the performer actually did identify as trans, that it is a potentially reckless thing to cast them in this. Again, trans people in general and trans youth in particular are incredibly vulnerable right now, and they are frequently targeted. And I don't think it would be a responsible thing for either a production company or the parents of a young actor to place a trans actor in the crosshairs of this very, very toxic culture war, especially in a already kind of toxic property with a lot of toxic discussions and fan rage circling around it for various reasons. I could also probably argue that it might be borderline unethical to cast even a cisgender minor in a part like that. And I'm not even saying that I'm personally taking the stance that it would have been irresponsible, reckless, or otherwise just something that you shouldn't do to cast a trans young actor. But I can see someone making that argument, and I would understand why they would make it. Of course, that brings up the question, did we actually have to cast a minor at all? Like, it's pretty common to cast older actors to play minors. Now, of course, that's usually a choice made in the broad scale. You know, you get a show where it's set at a high school, but the entire cast is in their early 20s. That becomes a consistent aesthetic. If you cast some of them as actual teenagers, some of them as 20-somethings, the contrast is going to look really bad, and you end up with a Dear Evan Hansen situation on your hands. And Last of Us did already establish casting around the same age as the actual characters with the casting of Ellie, which is actually worth noting as well. The show does already have a non-binary actor on set, that being Bella Ramsey. Bella Ramsey is non-binary. They've been really good in this part, but he's also gotten a fair bit of crap, actually quite a bit from chuds who are just mad. They get hung up on the idea that they're not as attractive, and that's just kind of gross. Again, that's another tangent I could easily go down a rabbit hole on, but I do wonder if at some level within the corporate mindset, at the producer level, did they think they had a little bit of a shield against that concern since they already had a non-binary actor? And yes, playing a cisgender character, no, that doesn't invalidate my earlier point that trans and non-binary actors are frequently not considered for cisgender parts. I didn't say it never happens. I said it rarely happens. This is, in fact, one of the exceptions. Now, in the video game, it's worth noting Lev was actually played by a trans actor. He was played by Ian Alexander, who was about 18 at the time of filming, and at the time of filming was trans masculine and using he, him pronouns. They have since adopted a non-binary identity and use they, them pronouns, but that wasn't the case at the time that they were cast in that part. So they were both no longer a minor and also, at the time, identified as that thing, which I will do a little sidebar on this. I'm sure there are some people who will make an argument for, okay, but what if this actress actually is transmasculine but just isn't out yet? This is a difficult sort of thing to broach. Now, this is a big part of why I am stressing no harassment should be directed to her, because it's not really any of our business if she's transmasculine or not. As far as publicly available information and how she is presented and how she has been talked to and about and how she herself has expressed herself, it is as a cisgender young woman. Now, if that changes in the future, will that alter my opinions on this? No, because as far as the people watching this, if they are familiar with her work at all, which they might be, she was in Star Wars Skeleton Crew, their understanding of her is going to be as a young woman, which runs into the exact same problem that I mentioned with casting cisgender people who are the gender that the character transitioned out of. Regardless of whether or not she adopts a different identity in terms of her gender at a later point in time, that will not impact how this gets received right now. But to circle back to Ian Alexander, part of me honestly wonders, did they consider just asking them to play the part? Because I think they could still pass for that age. And if you think somebody now in their 20s might have a hard time passing for that, I'm going to direct you to this individual. This is Bowron Mullen, an actor in the UK who's not only transmasculine, but also deaf. And not too long ago, he appeared in a television episode over there playing a 14-year-old in his 20s. And no, I'm not implying that Bowron himself should have been cast in this part, although he should be cast in more stuff, and you should follow him on TikTok. He's an absolute delight. My point is that rather, if the concern is that we can't find someone over 18 who's transmasculine who would pass for a younger age, I'm just trying to show you it's not an impossible thing to do, even if you have already established that you are generally casting around the age of the characters, as what happened with Bella Ramsey playing Ellie. Now, as I said, this doesn't really happen too much anymore, and it is a little bit odd to see, and that means we're regressing backwards. And the thing is, ultimately, I don't know what the chicken and the egg on this is, because I cannot deny that the current incredibly toxic environment for trans people in this country right now, that is literally coming from the highest office in the land, is something that shouldn't be considered or should have zero impact. Like, in my mind, it shouldn't, but like, that's not realistic. I know that. So I don't know what the chicken and the egg is on a matter of, we're going to cast this person anyway, and that's probably for the best, since if we actually cast a trans youth, that might feasibly put us even more in the crosshairs of culture war nonsense than we already were. Or if it was a case of, let's not get into culture war nonsense, so let's be sure that we don't cast an actual trans youth. I mean, the effect is ultimately the same either way, whether they cast this person and maybe even through an actual open audition process. Again, I would say cisgender actors shouldn't have been part of that, but if they were and she beat out actual trans actors as the best candidate, I still reject that as a general argument as best for the part. But if they at least went through that process and that's who they landed on, well, then they have the additional benefit of sidestepping having a trans youth on set. Bella Ramsey is 22 at the time of my talking, and so far as I'm aware, they have never been on a hormone regimen as part of their non-binary identity. They are no longer part of the trans youth conversation the way that the character and any potential young actor playing Lev is. And that's kind of the extra stuff that I wanted to be sure that I covered, because dealing with a character this young, I think, brings a heightened tension to the conversation of it should have been a trans actor, because when you're talking about adult characters, honestly, I think it's kind of hard to take the position that it shouldn't be played by a trans actor. When you're dealing with youth, suddenly you have immediately stepped into the notion of you shouldn't be transing kids in the first place. So I get how this happened. And I want to acknowledge that there are circumstances that I think lent to this happening, despite the fact that as a general practice, this had been dying down. But while I can be understanding that there are reasons why it happened in this case, even though it hasn't happened as much in general, it's still a step backwards. It's still a backslide. It is still a thing that is a problem and has been a problem for a long time. And I've been talking about for, I think, 8 years now. And had kind of largely gone away for stuff made in the US, at least. And honestly, looking back on it, I was maybe even a little too harsh on Squid Game because I don't know as much about the specifics of Korean culture and trans people standing over there. So while I stand by my overall positions, I was not as knowledgeable about that. But talking about the US, progress had been made in this area in terms of the casting, and now this is a step back. And even if it is more justifiable, again, I'm not saying that I think it is okay, but there are definitely specific circumstances of this that I think make it a little bit more defensible, or at least understandable that this happened in this case. It's going to become an example of like, see, we don't have to cast trans people in trans roles. We went back to doing it the old way and it's just fine. And it's not. But also nuance is a thing. And the reality we are currently in complicates things because both the character and the actor are underage. There were a lot of ways that they could have worked around that. They could have gotten even just an 18-year-old who is actually trans, and that would have avoided at the very least the issue of the actor being a minor. But they didn't. So here we are. I don't agree with this casting. Not the actress's fault. But I also do see how we got here. And I think it'd be dishonest of me to pretend that I didn't see that. What are your thoughts on any of this? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe, maybe even if you want. No pressure. Actually, a little bit of pressure. It legitimately does help, especially the Patreon. I've got life stuff that is a lot right now. But anyways, ultimately, that is not the most important thing. The most important thing, and I mean this, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You're the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lafula, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Oliver B, Mystic Shadow, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Becky Sparks, Twylord, Tracy Scrabbit, Pal Barabajoggle, Magdalena, Sir Didymus is my favorite. And to thank some supporters from the lower tiers, thank you to Wordmaker, Lucy Llewellyn, and Beginner's Mind Podcast. And if you want to hear me say your name as well, you can check out the rewards on the Patreon, and there's other stuff besides, and it'll help keep these absurd creatures fed.